Welcome everybody to our 9th Deeper Inquiry session. These sessions were created for us to exchange thoughts around what we consider, and in the wider community of European activists and movements that we mingle with, what we consider important topics, pressing topics, maybe topics that haven't received enough attention. And two friends are going to take it away today, and we're going to discuss post-capitalist philanthropy, something that also is intrinsically of importance to the Querida Foundation, as we are trying to model radically different forms of distributing and redistributing resources from the wealthy and into the gaps of wealth hoarding that have been created. And finding the most just participatory ways of doing that. So on this journey of metamorphosis and bringing ideas of how to reinvent philanthropy, Lynn and Alnoor have produced an epic read, so a book that they will tell you a little bit more about, but I will not waste any more time and pass the baton to Lynn Murphy and Alnoor Ladha. Take it away, and you can tell us a little bit about yourselves as well.
Thanks, Ivan. Thanks, Teresa. Thanks to Guerrilla for hosting us. So we were gonna share a little bit about the book, almost like a little précis. I think we have like half an hour or 40 minutes for that, and then really open it up to discussion. I think the most interesting parts of this will happen when we open up dialogue, and so we're just going to share some initial ideas. I'm not going to say a lot by way of intro or background, but to say that my background is in political strategy and movement building and organizing, so I do not come from a philanthropic background. I spent the last 15-20 years having to interface with the philanthropic industrial complex, and as someone who is working in movements and working in not-for-profits, etc., as many of you have, and I've also been advising foundations for the last few years as well. So I've got to see sort of both sides of that, and that's probably enough of kind of orientation on my background, and I'll let Lynn say a little bit about hers.
Hello. Oh, good afternoon, good evening, good morning to those of us still on this side of the planet. What's relevant here to share? I'm as we said in our bios for the book, an accidental former philanthropy, or philanthropoid, as I often would refer to it, meaning in the institution. My background before that was working and studying a lot of different movements and NGO advocacy campaigns across the geopolitical South in connection with Europe and other places in the world, harkening back to the debt relief movement around the time of 2000s. And a philanthropy came looking for me, actually. And so when I finished my graduate studies, I then worked for the Hewlett Foundation for a number of years, primarily in the sector of schooling, and saw firsthand both how the philanthropic arms and the international development NGO architecture, and indeed schooling itself, is so inextricably linked to modernity and neoliberalism that I got to the place where I had to resign. I had that critique walking in the door, tried to do the best I could, and walked out as we say, kind of as a place of a conscientious objector to that kind of paradigm and system. And somewhere along the way, in trying to reimagine what the world would look like outside of the parameters of Karl Marx and Adam Smith, rather, I met Alnoor. And for the last couple of years, we've been co-guiding something called the Transition Resource Circle, which we call kind of a temporary organizational zone that's really sitting with the inquiry of how do we liberate capital in this moment to be contextually relevant. And that inquiry gave rise to this book, which we can go into a little bit more, some of the key lines of that. And then, as Alnoor said, like really look forward to having discussion with you. So thank you. And maybe I'll just start with a couple of introductory comments about the book before Alnoor will begin with kind of the first part of the book. And since Alnoor and I aren't sitting in the same place, I'm just looking to him to confer. And I just wanted to start with reading the prayer that we put in the book rather than a dedication. This is to this, we dedicate this text, this words, this inquiry. So I'll just start there. May this text serve the healing of all beings, including the fallen deity of money and its offspring, shadow and alibi, philanthropy. May the colonized mind and body be liberated, including our own. So in that way, we recognize, and this is as we start with a number of paradoxes, just to name just a couple here briefly. The paradox of pronouncement. And here I'm referring to, as I'm on this Zoom call speaking in English, this hegemonic language that confers power and excludes many, as does the written word. And at the same time, and what you'll hear is we want to invoke the non-dual, the beyond the subject-object gaze of separation, and we want to invoke embodied cognition that often goes beyond what we're able to do when we're in this paradox of pronouncement, whether it be through the written text, through the use of logic, even as we're invoking trans logic and more than logic. So we recognize we're in that paradox. We also recognize that we're in the paradox of performance. And what I mean by that is that
we're losing you, Lynn.
The glitch gods are not being merciful.
It's the spirit of performance, so you can see it as spontaneous miming.
Exactly, and that's part of the paradox as well. The emergent universe is in dialogue with us. So I'll just finish that thought for Lynn, and then go into the content of the book. So what we list 9 or so paradoxes at the beginning of the book, and one of them is this: is the paradox of performance, which is we're trying to invoke non-dual states, trying to get to sort of witness consciousness, let's say, to step outside of the culture in order to see the culture, yet we are performing aspects of the culture even though we're critiquing that culture. And even as conscientious objectors of neoliberalism, we're all embedded within that, and that's part of that paradox. So I'm going to stop there on the kind of preamble for the book, because I'm just also sensitive of time. And there's a lot to get through in the next 15 minutes or so. So, oh, sorry, Lynn, you're back.
Yeah, in the meantime, Lynn is back, just so you know.
Great.
She's at the, she came in a bit.
We dance with the awkward of what are the limitations of using these minerals to project in. Alnoor, yeah, I'm sure you covered the rest of that and set it up the things. So thank you for the grace.
Yeah, you're back. You're still a little choppy, Lynn. You're coming in and out, so we'll just see how it goes. So I'm going to share screen just to share some slides. Can everyone see slides? Great. So we're going to start with where the book starts. And is it doing the meta thing where the Zoom view is coming over the slide, or you can see all of it? Okay, you can see it. Great. So we're going to start where the book starts, which is this idea of nested hierarchies. And many people will be familiar with this type of thinking. It's essentially a structural historical worldview. If you know the work of people like Emanuel Wallerstein and the work of historical capitalism, or Samir Amin and other global South political philosophers, and many, this is not sort of original thinking. The gist of it is that the existing global operating system, which we can call neoliberalism, some people call it capitalist modernity, or late stage capitalism. The way we've been thinking about this is that We like the frame of capitalist modernity. For those of you who know the work of Abdullah Öcalan, who wrote Manifesto for Democratic Civilization. He was the co-founder of the PKK and the Kurdish resistance, and is now sitting in solitary confinement in a Turkish prison. He was the co-founder of Rojava, the radical experiment in Kurdistan, in autonomous Kurdistan. And what we like about the frame of capitalist modernity is it's not just the political economy of capitalism. It's also merging it with the social cultural project of modernity in sort of one totalizing project. And that neoliberalism, as we're defining it here, is just the latest chapter of capitalist modernity. So that's the way to think about this. This broader frame of nested hierarchies is, of course, true for capitalist modernity. And at the highest level, what the neoliberal operating system or the capitalist modernity, the system of capitalist modernity does is it infuses not just sort of political economic structure or values, but it goes much deeper than that. It has a theology, it has an ontology, it has a cosmology. It sort of defines the parameters of what it is to be human, what our role in the broader ecosystem of life is, purpose, why we do what we do, and how we actually see the world. And that's fundamental to understand. So just to give you an example, within neoliberalism, there's a worldview that humans are inherently selfish and competitive, right? We are red in tooth and claw. This sort of came from Enlightenment logic, that we are in this zero-sum competitive game in order to survive, and that plays down at the individual level, that the locus and the center of analysis and focus is the individual unit. That individualism is sort of centered in the culture, and that hierarchy is necessary in order for order essentially to exist. And then what's really at the kind of base level of the operating system is this cosmology of separatist, materialist, rationalist worldview. And so what that means in practice is that we are entrained and conditioned to see the world as separate constitutive parts that can be reduced materially to their constitutive subparts, and that our relationship is one of separation and duality, and that all of this can be understood by the human mind. And not only it can, we are entitled to that understanding. That the role of science and the role of the march of progress and modernity is for us to come up with the theory of everything, you know, what scientists arrogantly call the grand unified theory. And then the world is understood. It is complete through the human gaze, through the anthropocentric gaze. And that the only way we can organize society within that is one of capitalist competition, and who acquires goods and services through the cutthroat game of neoliberalism is inherently smart, virtuous, likable, deserving, etc. Right? So that's kind of the oxygen by which we breathe, the invisible architecture of ideology. And so then when we go one layer below to the, let's say, the sectors, there's no sector that's outside of that, and philanthropy is no exception, right? People will often say things like, well, technology will save us, or science will save us, or crypto will save us, or whatever. And the point of this nested hierarchy slide is to say that these are all subsectors of neoliberalism. When you look at science, for example, who decides what research will be done? Where do those people go to university? How do they pay for those universities? What is the ideological underpinning of those universities? All of this is sort of determined within the broader operating system. And so there's very little freedom and flexibility. And that's also true for philanthropy. Philanthropy as a sector is an extension and an externality of neoliberalism. Right? A few people have amassed so much wealth that they're now deciding the agenda for civil society. There's almost no social movement, unless it's a completely volunteer-run movement, that is not dependent on some way on funds trickling down from big philanthropy. And there's almost no civil society organization or not-for-profit or NGO that is not getting philanthropic funding, either from nation-state departments of so-called development or big philanthropy or family foundations of philanthropy. And as we talk about philanthropy, we're really going to focus on institutional philanthropy, the concentration of wealth that is sitting in these foundations that then is really determining the agenda for how social change happens. And so it's both and the reason we've focused on philanthropy is for the reason I just said, A, it's the upstream, right? It's affecting all aspects of social change work. B, as an externality of the existing system, rather than seeing it as in similar ways to other sectors, it sort of positions itself as the solution and the alternative that will bring about some kind of state change. And that's really important as a sort of fundamental part of the irony and the paradox and the absurdity of the moment we're in. And one of the premises we're bringing is, part of the crisis is the way that philanthropy is responding to and involved in the crisis itself, that it is self-perpetuating. Then the next sort of fractal of that are institutions. So Lynn and I, in our research, we interviewed over 100 people for this book, funders, activists, funder activists, indigenous elders, social movement leaders, cosmologists, anthropologists. And what sort of came up over and over was this idea that as institutions, there's this belief that there is more freedom than there is for a sector or an operating system. But when the rubber hits the road, what ends up happening is people end up replicating the logic of the broader sector because it's structurally ordered, right? The rules are generative. And so we met someone at the beginning of our research who was a tech billionaire and came into lots of money and was super excited to set up their foundation and thought that they were going to be able to do all of these radical things. And then essentially they got bound within the IRS tax code, the 501c3 tax code, but also not just the physical structure, but the culture of philanthropy, the solutionism, the technocratic bureaucracy of the thing, the lack of vision, the Byzantine courts, all of the accoutrements and entrapments of that particular culture embedded in the institution, even though they thought they had a blank slate. And then it's also true at the individual level, that even the most radical person within these structures is replicating the logic of capitalist modernity and neoliberalism. And it's also done at a somatic level. It's internalized at a very deep level, at a very deep cellular level. So I'm not going to say much more about that, and we can get into debate and discussion on how that works. But essentially, that's the kind of the overall frame for the situating philanthropy within the bigger puzzle. And then Lynn, want to talk a bit about this?
Yeah, so as Alnoor referenced, we spoke to over 100 people, and then ourselves have been engaged in many different movements. And so we want to acknowledge that we're not the only ones who are having this deep critique of this global operating system and neoliberalism, and even how it shows up in philanthropy and how we need to move beyond these systems of domination and exploitation. And many of us know there's a decolonizing movement going on in many different versions, including within philanthropy. And as we sat with that, what we saw is, and what this slide is suggesting, is that there was a very simple model that a man named Bill Sharp came up with that looks at three different horizons. And horizon one would be, how do we reform to bring greater equity into our world as we see it? I'm applying this framework to the topic we're having, by the way. The framework goes beyond this. Horizon two would be, what would be disruptive enough to break down the current world that we know, and actually, in the language at Alnoor, and I use usher in transition pathways. And then horizon 3 would be, again, and what we're speaking to would be, how do we invoke and or live post-capitalist realities? And as we had many conversations and acknowledged this movement towards what's often called the just transition, we recognize that a lot of the language or the discourse might be sitting in that horizon 2, but a lot of the tactics and or the way that the various NGOs were stuck within the philanthropic contract were still in horizon 1. So I come from the US, and so you can think of things within that are trying to green the economy, but they're still stuck in the capitalist logic, or trying to make democratic reforms that are still within the idea of the nation state and the capture, and are not actually looking at where is wealth and power concentrated. So what we started to see with all of this is that the justice movement is often very ethically looking for greater equity, but it is still within the house of modernity. As one of our dear beloved accompaniment circle and interviewees, Bayo Komalafe, said, justice will get us a seat at the table, but it will never let us leave the house of modernity. And so we kept seeing this, that there is a demand for justice, and there's a necessary demand for justice. But absent a deeper interrogation into the thought forms that don't just lead us to take power from elites and put them in the hands of community, but without a deeper understanding of thought forms and what we refer to as an ontological shift or ontological shifts, that we can't actually liberate ourselves from the structures that are underlying abuse and power and privilege and domination. So what we call for, and Alnoor could move, is this work on justice, just transitions, plus what we refer to as ontological shifts. And if you look at this simple visualization, on the left is kind of the neoliberal logic, this fractal logic of where we all are caught, and especially foundations and philanthropy and wealth holders, and often even many NGOs in the dominant system logic, where we are separate individuals competing for resources, where we have often unconscious biases and hero worship of some of those who have amassed large amounts of wealth. We confer a lot of power and authority onto them, to moving towards more emergent, and we'll get into this a little bit more, spiral logic, other ways that are looking at how do we see ourselves a web of relationships in a more than human realm? How are we really centering a set of what we call post-capitalist values that look at interdependency, solidarity, humility, compassion, reverence, and sacredness of life? And the key in this, what we're speaking for ontological shifts, is that nexus point in that. And in this, what I want to speak to is that this is not a one-time shift. It is that we are all, I can speak to myself as coming in as a white woman in an Occidental tradition, coming from the US, that it is a lifelong endeavor for me to continue to practice and find ways where my very way of seeing reality itself, my very ways of knowing, why I think what I think and why I know what I know, that is itself a call for this ontological shift. So what we refer to as this justice plus ontological shifts is, for us, something that many Indigenous communities and others who've been living post-capitalist realities for hundreds of years since first contact, that they recognize that we need to live in a relational field, that we need to see the more than human realm as kin, not as resources to be extracted. And that we have to kind of come back to this humble place of ontological shifts, that we need that change of consciousness to go alongside what we're asking for in terms of justice in the material Cartesian notions and logics.
And maybe I'll just add, what we mean by ontology is more like the philosophical use of it, rather than the more kind of pop meme culture kind of use of it, where onto is vision. So it's literally the way in which we see the world, which determines the manner by which we approach. And so to go back to that neoliberal example of separatist, materialist, rationalist, like my computer is sitting on a table, and because of the way my ontology has been entrained, I see this table as separate to me, and that I am entitled to manipulate it in whatever way I wish, right? Because it's just dead, inert, inanimate matter. The kind of converse of that, if we were to look at indigenous traditions or mystical traditions, is that this piece of wood is kin that I'm in a relationship to and with and through, and it has sacrificed its life in order to be in relationship with me in this way. And so rather than being entitled, I'm entrusted and I'm entangled with this being. And so part of what we're saying is that it's not that like the demands for justice are not important and necessary. Of course they are. But without commensurate shifts ontologically, we end up replicating the structures of the dominant culture, right? And we've seen this all the time. I don't think we need to even belabor the point that vanguard movements, progressive parties, et cetera, end up replicating the logic of the system, because there's no commensurate shift in consciousness and in the way the world is seen, interacted with, and lived, and that's as important. And the manner by which we approach is going to determine the outcomes, rather than some kind of neat linear strategy that we're going to figure out. And that's kind of what a lot of the research has sort of pointed to. And so I'll just go to the next slide, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but this just sort of highlights some of these ontological shifts that we're talking about. And I talked a bit about moving from kind of rationalism to this more radical relationality, and also moving from materialism to this more animistic worldview of interacting with a living universe in a non-dual kind of queer quantum way. And we can spend more time on these at some other point. This is a piece of art that a dear sister Afro-Colombian artist named Elixa Garcia did for the book, and you'll see when you get the book that there's lots of sort of other ways of knowing and being and sensing, even in how we're trying to relay the content of the book. We'll send a link out as well. The book is on a gift model for the PDF, and we'll put that in the chat box. So I'm just going to move into the kind of spiral logic. So this is one of the ways we think about sort of antidote logic to the pyramid logic of the dominant culture. And so if we start in the middle, which is cosmology, right, which is often the thing that is not discussed. We sort of incorporate the invisible ideology and cosmology of the dominant culture without ever really having the conversations about why do we think we're here, where do we think we're going, what is our metaphysical worldview, what is our understanding of the embeddedness of the human being in this broader congress of life, what is a human being. Those conversations are seen as like academic and sort of out there, and we abdicate our responsibility, and we give religious institutions, media, political leaders, Wikipedia, the sort of power to determine these things for us. And part of what we're saying is this is central to the broader process. And again, this is not linear, right? We're not saying go and have a think about your cosmology, contemplate cosmology, and the rest will be sorted. As we say at the bottom, it's multi-directional, it's reflexive, it's interconnected. We're sort of approaching this as almost like a quantum ethics, where there's co-creation, creation, agency, and context all dancing with each other. And so as that process is happening, there's also a recasting of the individual as a web of relational entanglements. And all sorts of science is showing us this, right? From what we're learning about the gut biome, that, you know, we are essentially made up of bacteria that we are hosts of. So the idea of an individual self is illusory down to a cellular level. Now, of course, wisdom cultures have been saying this for millennia, that we are who we are through others, right? I don't have a name for myself, right? My position and my role and my self-reflexivity is determined by the web of relationality I'm embedded in. And so the recasting of that sort of feeds the cosmology, and the cosmology feeds that. And so this is this kind of ongoing living praxis. And that these individual webs are then embedded in broader social ecologies, you know, what we think of as communities or institutions or movements, that these are not static things that we are in service to. We often get caught up in the loyalty to a certain foundation or a certain political party, but these are just living social ecologies made up of webs of relational entanglements. And that when we think of philanthropy, it's essentially a biome, not really a sector. It's holding something, and it's holding these ecologies. And that holding requires responsibility and an understanding of consequence. You know, what is it to be hoarding money at the end of history as we know it? What are the karmic spiritual implications of that? Why do we feel entitled to make these decisions around who gets money in what way, in what geography? Because we've imported the logic that says that someone who's done well in the private sector or had grandparents that were robber barons or what have you is sort of entitled to make these decisions. And part of what we're saying is that there's something else at play here. And this is part of the recasting and the rethinking. And then thinking of these sectors as biomes feeding into a broader superstructure. So we could think of the superstructure, you know, in a Marxist sense, this is what we would call the political economy of late stage capitalism. And part of what we're trying to do is recast these superstructures in terms of being mycelial service. So the role of the nation state is to be in service to bioregional confederalism, bioregional cooperation. And that none of these initiatives, efforts, entanglements are outside of the planetary ecology, the broader Gaian entelechy. And by that sense, we mean that Gaia herself is a living being with her own agenda, her own agency. And part of our task is to better understand her desires and her needs as fractal parts of the whole, as opposed to individual agents with rational decision-making abilities who can come up with a strategy in absence of understanding the will of our host. Right? That this is an insane idea, that the kind of fever dream of materialist rationalism that has been driving us and drives all of our sectors, including social change, has sort of led us to the place we are now, to this current moment of the meta crisis and this intellectual, spiritual, cognitive cul-de-sac that we call capitalist modernity. So Lynn, do you want to, we'll take maybe just a breath there, because I know we've said a lot, and then I'm going to ask Lynn to just explain the last framework, which is the 5 elements mandala, which is just one way we perceive as sort of, so where do we go from here?
Yeah, so as you just take a breath, and I'll offer that as Alnoor really and I sat with, like, well, what are we invoking with this idea of transition pathways? If we're looking within 5, the spiral logics, and we're looking at philanthropy as a biome embedded within a social ecology, and rather than individuals, we are embedded within webs of relationships. This is our subjective view, a way to see transition pathways. And we work with the elements, as you'll see, and the mandala representing a map and also a journey, and that's connecting the inner world to the outer world. And so Alnoor will have to click through these slides as I can. So the first piece of this starts with the first axis is about restoration and solidarity. And here we're talking about a restoring of right relationships, of acknowledging historical injustices and coming back to a place of healing and restoration. And the solidarity is a deepening praxis. And this axis is in restoration with the element of water, the solidarity with indigenous peoples, those who are stewarding much of where the world's biodiversity still is. These are the you can imagine kind of the tributaries of life, of those who have been and have already survived the onslaught of capitalism and have continued to be in right relationship with the earth. So what is it to practice solidarity in a restorative lens with indigenous peoples, and all of the work that philanthropy and the other movements and NGOs might do? So that's the water element. On the other side of that axis is the element of fire. And here we're really calling for solidarity with social movements, those that are often on the front lines and primarily across the geopolitical South, where the world's majority live, who are pointing the way on myriad different issues and efforts. Many of you, I'm sure, on this call are on the front lines or in lines of allyship with those who are on the front lines with issues that need to point the way. They're the fire that catalyze our awareness and our attention for what we need to see happen. And again, we're invoking this: how do we be in solidarity? How does philanthropy and others stand in right relationship with social movements and indigenous people through this restorative lens? So the other axis on the 5-element mandala is the transformation and creation. And if I start at the top, it's the air element. We need to create new, ancient, emerging cultural contexts. As we did this research, we recognized the real dearth of the collective imaginary for what would constitute post-capitalist realities. Many know the cliche that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. What is it that's giving rise to that? And so here we really are calling for different narrative intervention work on the deeper memetics that is influencing us, the cultural curators and artists to come together to help us in the collective imaginary for what life-centric ways of living and being that can get into the cultural norm, the cultural milieu. So that's the top of the axis, and the bottom really grounds this mandala, the earth element. And here we're speaking to the creation of post-capitalist infrastructure. And this includes many of the efforts for bioregional sovereignty, the bioregional assets, the land, water, health, education, cultural sovereignty in a bioregional physical geography. This is the hard work of coming together, not in exploitative relationships, but what we see in the material realm that is itself building up post-capitalist infrastructure for the preservation of life. This includes experiments in alternative communities and currencies and other, what you could imagine there as well. And then in the center of this 5-element mandala is the element of ether. And I think Alnoor, if he clicks one more, we'll get there. Yeah. And so ether, this is the 5th element, and here it's representing life force. And what we're speaking to is this recultivation of life force. And this is where a lot of the work on working with trauma, and not trauma to be better adjusted to the systems of modernity, but recognizing the historical legacies of trauma, the epigenetic inheritance of that and working at that, not just on the individual, but on the collective level. This is where we see the resurgence of what some of us in a Western tradition might call mystery schools, other ways of being and knowing, where there are work that's happening for connection with the more than human realm, a whole other way of dancing with life force itself, that many of us have often spent our time in what's often called the fight, flight, or freeze response, where we're actually not fully aligned, where we can be creative, where we can imagine a post-capitalist infrastructure, where we can find not how to transactionalize our relationships, but in this recultivation of life force, embody this shift of consciousness that we're evoking to bring forth this post-capitalist vision. And I'll leave it there and see if Alnoor wants to add anything else before we just offer a final reflection and then open it up.
No, I think it's a good place to stop and just to say that you know, we're not saying this is the answer or the framework, right? I come from an anarchist political philosophy. I come from a mystical spiritual tradition. This is an offering. We're not in the belief of sort of objective truth with a capital T, but that if what we're thinking about is how do we create the context for ontological shifts. Part of what we're saying is that we need to have food, land, water, energy, sovereignty. That infrastructure needs to be created, and that in the short period of time that we have, a good use of capital would be to build post-capitalist infrastructure. And this is also the paradox of the moment we're in, right? Is that we know we have an upper bound sort of limit, right? That the growth-based model is a self-terminating logic. And you know, the first time that economists and ecologists agree that we're not going to have another doubling of the global economy, and at 3% growth, there's a requirement for a doubling every 20 years. We've reached 6 of the 9 planetary bounds. You know, we're mitigating for a 3-degree rise in temperature by mid-century at this point. We have no idea what's going to happen, and so part of the urge and the impulse of this is that we should use the existing funds that we have to be in solidarity with and help support the building of infrastructure led by indigenous peoples of culture, social movements, especially from the global south and historically marginalized places, help shift the cultural context, the oxygen we breathe, and importantly, that we cannot do this in absence of or outside the notion of healing itself. That the idea that these are things that are not the purview of philanthropy or social change, right? That your health insurance will cover it, or that, you know, doing like ceremony is somehow outside of the political work. This is sort of what we're challenging, that there's an inner and outer mirroring happening, and by focusing on the spiritual political praxis of ontological shifts, that the universe will meet us halfway, that the Gaian entelechy will meet us halfway, that there's a dialogue that's happening. Our desire to like figure out the strategy and impose our solutionism on the world is part of the problem and is exasperating and replicating the logic of the existing system, including our own burnout and the weakening of our life force as webs of relations within these movements and within the broader social change sector. So I'm going to stop there. And we could open up for some questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay, so like I've already had some engagement with the book, and also I've interacted with Alnoor and Lynn, so I am also aware that there is quite a bit of density to this content. But on repeated engagement with it, you really find a lot of tangible, relevant offerings for mental, like micro mental shifts. So how is this work being done, for example, in philanthropy, in traditional philanthropy of, okay, we come with really good motivation to do good, but then it's completely separated from the life disabling ways even a meeting is organized. Like the basic conversations that will happen around a table are devoid of presence, of actually even like feeling in the body. And this is also something that you touched upon. And a subtext to all of this that I just wanted to also touch on is the visuals that are being used. I got completely lost in the spiral video because it was a video. It was like playing in my brain. I was seeing lotuses and things. So like being able to model entanglement and actually feel it through your own apparatus for perception, visual perception, being able to encode it in this way by being guided with some words, but then consuming it through completely different apparatus makes a huge difference than just talk or just interaction. So I'm just drawing attention to how we present this information, what we do, the responsibility we carry when we pass on this information, and the thought of what are the different ways and approaches. Because also Lynn opened up with, okay, be aware of the limitations of the context in which we are operating. So because we are like a frog in boiling water. And this was the quote that came up in my brain when Alnoor was finishing. So instead of like going in an accelerationist approach and saying, okay, let's speed up the suicide, how can we be honoring life supporting systems and facilitate this transition? This was an unintentional mental wrap up I did for myself. So I have some questions, but if people also want to ask things, I don't want to get in the way. So if anybody wants to put their hand up or just go for it, they can. Otherwise, I will engage. So I will give you.
It's a small enough circle, I think, that we could do if people want to unmute, or maybe just put your hand up so we know that what the cue is, and then feel free to unmute if you're first.